We are delighted to have Mustafa Akyol joining us on the 15th episode of the Human Progress Podcast. Mustafa is an expert on Islam and public policy and a dear colleague in the Cato Institute's Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. He writes regularly for the New York Times and has written many books, including this year, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom and Tolerance, and most recently, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty. How are you, Mustafa?
Thank you so much, Chelsea. It's great to have this conversation with you, and thanks for your gracious introduction. It's a pleasure to be colleagues with you, and I'm happy that we have a chance today to talk about my latest book.
Same. So let's get right into it. Please, in broad strokes, paint a picture of what this book is about. And because this is the Human Progress Podcast, how does it relate to prospects for progress and the future of liberty in the Muslim world?
Sure. The idea for this book came about a year or more than ago when Aaron, our colleague, from libertarianism.org at the Cato Institute, he walked in and said, Mustafa, why don't you write one book which puts all your arguments about Islam and liberty, that is religious liberty, economic, political, the broad value of liberty we cherish, in just one accessible volume, so everybody can get it and understand. Because I have other books like Reopening Muslim Minds is very deeply theological and philosophical. I make a lot of arguments there. But I wrote something back in Islam Without Extremes, and there are issues that I haven't actually touched upon in any of those books. So I said, okay, that's a good idea. And I'll write something that puts all my arguments in a nutshell, but accessible, and also with new episodes, new history anecdotes, and new arguments. And so this book came out, and as you will see, there are chapters in it, like chapters about Sharia, chapters about some of the problems in the Islamic world, but also some of the bases for advancing liberty, and some of the blessings of classical Islamic civilization too. I mean, people always think that everything in the past was bad and things are necessarily getting better in a global scale, maybe, but also there are times that things go down. And I showed that actually certain things went down in the Muslim world in the past few centuries because of bad paths of modernization. I mean, modernization was sometimes understood as building a giant state, that suffocates civil society. So you will see arguments about religious liberty, criticizing religious coercion. There are political ideas like, how do we establish an ideal state? Should it be based on conquest, or should it be based on a social contract? Is there a basis for that in Islamic thought? There's also discussion about something that most people may not know. Liberalism, in the classical sense of the term, was already a very popular idea in the 19th century among some Islamic intellectuals. These are people like Namık Kemal in the Ottoman Empire, or Tunisian Hayrettin Pasha. They were fascinated by liberal democracy, rule of law, freedom of speech, constitutional government that they saw in Europe. They admired it, and they looked back at the Islamic tradition. They tried to reconcile, and they did. They created these interesting ideas and theories. And I tried to give a sense of those early thinkers in Islam, which argued for religious, political, and economic freedom.
Right. You speak about seeds of liberty or precedents for classical liberal policies in Islam, but also how some interpretations of Sharia today have resulted in infringements on human rights and liberties. But you speak about reforming Sharia as actually reviving Sharia. Could you tell us what you mean by that?
Yeah, I kind of go both ways and try to make a sense of the broad Islamic tradition. First of all, I borrowed the term "the seeds of freedom" from my friend and colleague, a great scholar, Daniel Philpott. He's a scholar at Notre Dame. He's Catholic himself. And he's looking at Islam from a different religious perspective, obviously. But he has this book, Religious Freedom in Islam. And he says, well, there are really powerful passages in the Quran that vindicate freedom. One of them, the most oft-quoted one reads, there is no compulsion in religion, la ikraha fid din in Arabic. There are other passages in the Quran which says the truth is from your Lord God, let anyone who wants to believe it, believe it. let anyone who want to disbelieve it, disbelieve it. So that sounds like religious freedom. But when you look into the Islamic jurisprudence, that's the interpretation of Sharia, Islamic law, you will also see that these seeds of freedom were not cultivated. They were sometimes even suppressed. Because Islam got interpreted in an age of empires, religious authoritarian regimes, tyrannical rulers, which didn't need these ideas of liberty and didn't necessarily cultivate them. And the idea that religion should not be forced on anybody didn't go well with imperialism, which was the ruling idea and the concept of the time. So that's why, for example, I show in the book that when you read the Quran and you come to there's no compulsion on religion, it's fascinating. And when you look into what it meant in the Prophet Muhammad's life, you see, wow, it was against the idea that people should be converted to Islam. So it was against forced conversion. That's quite remarkable. But then I quote a contemporary scholar from Turkey, a conservative one, who says, no, this doesn't mean that there is no compulsion in religion. He says there is no compulsion to the religion only, but when you're in it, there's all sorts of compulsion. So they're kind of limiting the meaning of there. And I show why that has happened and why that shouldn't be understood as the universal true message of Islam. On the other hand, for example, when I speak of how to revive, what to revive from the Sharia, I make an emphasis there, which might not be obvious to some people. The value that we call separation of powers that Montesquieu, brought into Western political language, and which in the US turn into checks and balances. You say there's the executive and the legislative branch, and these are separate, and it's important to keep them separate. That already existed in classical Islam to an extent. The idea that Sharia, that is God-given law, is separate from the ruler, and it is even above the ruler, actually sometimes worked as a constraint on the rulers. And I tell the story of an Ottoman Sultan Mehmet II, who persecuted a Greek architect, and then the Greek architect went to a court, the Sharia court, and sued the Sultan, and he was summoned to the court, and he was given a punishment to actually compensate for the architect. So this is not something you can find in Saddam Hussein's Iraq or today's Bashar Assad's Syria. Unfortunately, some of the good values we could detect were partly lost, and some troubling interpretations became more dominant. So I think we are in a really grim period in the history of the Islamic civilization. But I'm trying to show that we do have seeds of freedom, and we can cultivate them with the right perspective. And the book is a call to have that perspective.
You also find a lot of reasons for optimism in the history of Islam, right? You speak about how the first Muslim state in Medina in some ways anticipated social contract theory, and you speak about especially the golden age of Islam and how there was a time when the Muslim world was at the forefront of progress in many areas and was relatively very tolerant. So could you walk us through some of that history?
Sure, definitely. By the way, you also wrote about the Islamic golden age and the thriving of philosophy and science and medicine at that time. So congratulations for that. You have a great article. It is indeed known to students of history that about 1,000 years ago, the Islamic civilization was the world's most productive civilization and most enlightened in many respects. There was more religious freedom compared to Christendom. That's why Jews fled from Europe to the Islamic world, especially the Ottoman Empire, where there was more religious pluralism. That's why it was Muslims who studied Aristotle or Plato and other Greek philosophers and brought that whole philosophical Greek tradition back to Europe via Spain at a time that Europe was really in a more dogmatic frame of mind. Actually, most Muslims know this. It's a nostalgia among Muslim communities around the world. Like 1,000 years ago, we had the best scientists. 1,000 years ago, Muslims were the ones who measured the size of the earth or calculated, or invented algebra or advanced mathematics and all that. Not invented, but in most cases advanced, let's say. That's why the word algorithm comes from al-Khwarizmi, and there are so many words in English, of course, that have Arabic roots precisely for this. And by the way, of course, there are Arabic numerals. They came from the Arab world, obviously. But what was the secret of that golden age is, I think, the big question. And you will find some imams today saying, oh, we were great, and because we were pious and God, blessed our piety, with earthly success. And it's a romantic explanation. And when you look at the facts, you don't find that, Muslims became less pious over time, or, the piety is necessarily the explanation. But I say there was another explanation, that Islamic world was, for its age, unusually cosmopolitan and open-minded. Muslims could study Aristotle and Plato and not get branded as heretics for that, right? They could translate these books. Later it happened, though. Studying of philosophy became criminalized over time. Or I mentioned an institution that few people may be aware. There's this courtly discussions called Majlis al-Munazara, or Salon of Debate. In the Abbasid Caliphate, the caliph would call Christian theologians and Muslim theologians and would say, discuss theology and make all the best arguments. And Christians, actually, I write there, Christians were scared and being like, can we really say something critical of Islam? This is an Islamic caliphate. The caliph said, this is a fair majlis, say what, open majlis, say whatever you say. And some people who heard this were shocked. Oh my God, like offensive words are being said against Islam, but it wasn't punished. And that was the engine of intellectual dynamism, because being exposed to different ideas, thanks to free speech, thanks to cosmopolitanism, was the driving force. And I think the decline of the great Islamic civilization, and ultimately which led to the current crisis, began with the criminalization of ideas. Oh, one sect of Islam is true. These are heresies, and heresies should be suppressed. Oh, philosophy is a heretical thing. We should never study it. We can get a little bit part of it, but then the rest is bad. So, and this got worse and worse. And in the modern era, it just turned into another crisis. Any idea that comes from, now ideas don't come from Greeks anymore, but from the West, right? From liberal thinkers. Oh, no, we don't need these. This is all heresy. This is all the whispers of the devil. So that sort of closed-mindedness is a problem. And I show that we Muslims should reopen our minds, again, to think on these issues. One thing, Western colonialism contributed to this crisis, because when you occupy people and say, we brought you freedom, they will not like freedom. And I make that point there as well, too. So there's a geostrategic angle in this problem that I'm talking about. But it is still important to be able to distinguish what is colonialism, what are the good ideas of progress. And we should not forget that in the West, colonialism has been criticized and rolled back thanks to free speech, right? People were able to criticize Western foreign policy, which is exactly what we need in Muslim majority countries.
Right. And you talk about how even though some Muslims do think of free markets or classical liberalism and political liberalism as something from the West, something colonial, actually, there are a lot of precedents in Islamic history for these things. For example, you talk about economic freedom in the early Islamic societies.
Exactly. And that chapter, the lost heritage, Islam's lost heritage of economic liberty. That's a chapter in why I defend liberty. As I do in every chapter, I begin with a story, when you actually go to Istanbul, millions of people go to Istanbul, my hometown, as tourists, and most of them go to the Grand Bazaar, which is a shopping mall built centuries ago, by the Ottomans. And when you walk into it, there are nice gates, gorgeous gates, and on one of them there's an engravement in Arabic, and it writes Al-Kasibu Habibullah, which means God loves those who earn. And it's like a promotion of business, basically, like something that God loves business and businessmen and merchants, traders. And who said this? Oh, it's a saying by Prophet Muhammad. Why? Well, he himself was a merchant. Actually, most early Muslims were merchants because Islam was born in a commercial environment, and Islam promoted trade. And thanks to that, Islam created a medieval capitalism, which was very creative. And for example, Muslims, instead of carrying money in a very long distance and with all the dangers affiliated with that, they started to write the amount of money in one location and to go at cash on the other place. And they called it sak, which means written document. which became the Czech in Europe. So I show these kind of cross-cultural influences. There's a whole literature actually by scholars like, from Maxim Rodinson to Benedict Köhler, most recently, who has written about the influence of Islam on Western capitalism. And I try to show some of the highlights there. I also recall and highlight a medieval Islamic thinker, Ibn Khaldun, who actually created a theory of this. He has this fascinating book, Muqaddimah, Introduction to World History. And he's hailed as he's hailed as the pioneer of many of the social sciences we have today. And he has many great ideas, but one thing is that he makes the argument that if for a state, for a country to thrive, he called them kingdoms or sultanates, taxes should be low so that people have incentive to do business. And if taxes are too high, that will discourage people from engaging in trade and business. And he says civilization will decline and collapse. Basically, he's making a free market, defense of free market against a intrusive state, against a state-managed economy. And it's no accident that he inspired Arthur Laffer. The Laffer curve comes from Ibn Khaldun. He inspired Ronald Reagan. Reagan quoted him in a TV show once. And sorry, not a TV show, like a press release, but it was on TV. Reagan quoted Ibn Khaldun in the New York Times article. So there is a Islamic contribution to the idea of free markets and a free economy.
Right. So the secrets to the success then of the Islamic Golden Age, you have economic freedom, reason, openness, cosmopolitanism, but also
freedom of speech.
Freedom of speech. Also limited government. You talk about how moving a little bit later in time during the age of absolutism in Europe, when the king was above the law in so many countries. In the Muslim world, this was not the case. And you have a great story to illustrate this about a sultan and an architect that will stay with me forever, I think. Would you like to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. That is the chapter titled, what we should revive from the Sharia. First of all, most of the people who may be hearing us, when they hear the word Sharia, it might have negative connotations, understandably so, because there are terrible things done in the name of Sharia today in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Taliban, in Afghanistan, because they implement a brutal, corporal punishments, a very illiberal understanding of the law. So there are a lot of problems there, and I show them actually in the book. There's a whole chapter on why terrible things are being done in the name of Sharia. But I also show that the original intentions were generally good, but when you have a blind, obsessive, textualism, that leads to many problems. But the other thing is, as you said, classical Islamic civilization was successful partly because, yes, the political authority was constrained. It wasn't absolute. The ruler just couldn't declare anything he wanted. For example, the ruler couldn't confiscate any property. Most of the time, rulers love to confiscate, right? They want to plunder, and that's what sultanate or kingdom most of the time in the world history brought to people. But because of the Sharia, which is God's law about the rulers, in the Islamic civilization, a civil society developed, and they're especially known as the Waqf. That's the Arabic term. And the English translation is foundation. Charitable foundations were formed in the classical Islamic civilization, foundations that supported hospitals, soup kitchens, libraries, schools, madrasas. Madrasa means school in Arabic. It's not necessarily, a bad institution. It's just any kind of school. So these are all financed by charitable foundations that were separate from the government. And they were protected from the government's encroachment. The Sultan couldn't get them because they're protected by Sharia, and the Sharia is about the Sultan. So this is actually the kind of limited state idea that has worked well in the Western tradition. Unfortunately, what happened in the 20th century and late 19th and early 20th century is that these charitable foundations in the Islamic world, which were separate from the government, which were autonomous, were gradually confiscated by governments. Why? Because the modernity they aspired to was inspired from fascist Italy or sometimes colonial powers. The French colonial rule in Algeria, limited these, confiscated some of these foundations. So we always think of modernity as a progressive force. It can be if it is liberal, but let's not forget fascism was modern, right? I mean, at some point it was new. So unfortunately, the Muslim world imported, there were already problems in the tradition, but in the modern era, some of the bad ideas from Europe, like Arab socialism, right? Socialism became Arab socialism, or like a fascist state, a one-party state. These were incorporated into the parts of the Muslim world, Arab republics like Egypt, Syria, Iraq. These are socialist republics in their foundations, and all the foundations were confiscated, taken over by the state. So today, by accepting a liberal political order, liberal in the classical sense, like a limited government, free markets, free speech, Muslims will be also reviving some of the values they already had before this wrong turn in the modern era. That means limited government, private companies, charitable foundations, and other foundations, Therefore, because we already got some ideas that are modern but were bad, I'm calling modern ideas that are good and also that have some roots in the Islamic tradition.
Right. Progress is not a straightforward path. You show how the success of classical Islam was due to particular policies and institutions. And you also show how many of those traditions were lost, how there was a conflict there between different jurists, some of whom were called the people of reason and others who were the people of theology. Could you walk us through what happened?
Sure, definitely. That is about the interpretation of Islamic law. So there are two approaches. This began, first of all, law has become a very important issue in Islam since the beginning. It's partly because Islam is a bit like Judaism, where the halakha, the observance of the law, how you eat, how you pray, how you live, how you organize society is connected to religion. And also because Muslims had states to rule, they needed law for those. So lawmaking, legislation has become a key issue. It's called fiqh, or jurisprudence, interpretation of the Sharia. That's God-given law. But in the beginning, there were two schools of thought. One was called, as you said, Ahl al-Ray in Arabic, which means people of reason or people of considered opinion, and Ahl al-Hadith, people of traditions or narrations. What was their difference? Well, the Ahl al-Ray, the people of reason, they were based in Iraq, in the cosmopolitan cities of Iraq. And at the time, Iraq was the world's most cosmopolitan place. First there was Kufa and then Baghdad. So these were the cities where you had the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews and the Zoroastrians and the Sunnis and the Shiites and different all colors and centers of trade. People were coming and going. So that cosmopolitanism led to a more rational and tolerant attitude. So these more progressive schools of thought evolved there. Whereas in Medina, in Hijaz, which is where Islam was born, but which is a desert environment and nobody goes there unless for religious reasons. It's not cosmopolitan. There's not much trade. There's not much change in social conditions. So the scholars based in Medina and let's say the broader Hijaz region resisted this rational approach. They said, you're just making laws out of your minds, but no, we have to find some sources for that. We have to figure out what the Prophet said exactly on this. So the idea that you should base everything in Islamic law to a text in the Quran or the Hadith, especially the Hadith, because the Quran everybody accepts, but the Hadiths are sayings of Prophet Muhammad. They were all around. So that created a more dogmatic approach to Islamic law. And that very effort, actually, in my view, led to the proliferation of Hadith, sayings of Prophet Muhammad, which are, by the way, not 100% trustable. These were written down almost 2 centuries after the Prophet. They canonized 2 centuries after the Prophet. So, and today, it's not an accident that a lot of the troubling rules in Islamic law, apostasy laws, blasphemy laws, stoning a woman, all these come from the Hadiths. Whereas from an Ahl al-Ray, people of opinion, let's say, the rationalist perspective, you can criticize these things and put them in context or even doubt the authenticity of their bases in hadiths. So, and this shows that religion and context influence each other. And unfortunately, a more dogmatic approach has influenced Sunni jurisprudence, which is the source of many problems that we have today. And I show, like, for example, how it has led to horrific consequences in Pakistan. I mean, there has been cases of women being raped and then sentenced for adultery. I mean, she's persecuted once, she's just violated once with a rape, and then she goes to a court and they say, there are no 4 witnesses to prove your case, so you are going to be sentenced for adultery because she got pregnant. That becomes an evidence of adultery, which is a perfect and tragic example of seeing how a blind obedience to something written without understanding the context and the consequences of that verdict leads to. Because yes, the Quran asked 4 witnesses for accusations of adultery, but adultery and rape are very different things. and the original intention was protecting actually women from libels of adultery, which I show in the book.
Right. You talk a lot about different passages that have been twisted over time in the actual context of them. And one passage that you spend a lot of time on is the one where the Quran says you must obey those in authority. And dictators love this passage because they interpret themselves to be those in authority. But then you talk about the actual context of that passage. Could you explain?
Sure. First of all, thanks for reading my book so carefully and meticulously and catching up all the important themes. And I discussed that issue. There's a chapter, should Muslims obey somebody, right? And I begin by telling that, I mean, there's this Quranic verse which says, obey God, Prophet Muhammad, the Prophet, and those in authority among you, right? And the Quran doesn't say who are those in authority among you. So every Islamic dictator basically claims to be that authority among you. So this could be states, leaders of states, like, I mean, a leader of Egypt or Saudi Arabia certainly uses that sort of basis in religion. Also, it could be the leader of Islamist groups, communities, at least to cultish obedience to whomever is at the leader of that person is in authority among you. But so this is a kind of teaching that has sustained a hierarchical authoritarian social order throughout history. I mean, and every Islamic group somehow refers to it. I mean, in Turkey, I know people obey Turkey's current president if they're Islamically tied to him, saying, oh, he's authority among us. It's not, of course, I mean, there are people in authority in liberal democracies too, but, you know, the relationship between you and them is contractual. You elect them and they have limits, so you're not supposed to obey. Well, if he's chosen, he has to manage certain things, but he's constrained by law. But the idea of obedience is more sweeping power and authority like it. So then I discuss, well, what does this verse really mean? And I go back to the earliest interpretations, tafsir as we call it in Arabic. Well, this verse was about one specific incident. I mean, Prophet Muhammad had certain battles. Sometimes he couldn't go to battle, and he appointed one person to lead a battle. And there was a dispute between that person and another person in the Sahaba. These are like companions of the Prophet. So those two people had a dispute, and it was about that particular instance. So this is a commandment given in a particular context. Like Prophet Muhammad, because he was the head of the first Muslim community, he had to lead the community. He was also making executive decisions, so people had to obey those executive decisions or the executive decisions of those who appointed. So it had a context, it has a limited meaning, but it was taken out of context and led to the interpretation of obedience to any Muslim ruler anywhere, which helps all the charlatans and so on and so forth. So I go back to some of these troubling interpretations in Islam from a perspective of liberty, and I show that they could be interpreted differently today. There were already alternative interpretations back then, maybe that we forgot, and this is how Muslims can look at these issues today without abandoning their loyalty to the core of their faith.
Right. So these are, there are many different interpretations, and you point out how in many cases these are the opposite of the original intent. A rule that was supposed to protect women from accusations of adultery now gets twisted in some instances to protect the rapists and so forth. But the original thing about the Sharia that you want to revive is something more akin to the natural law of Locke or of the American founding fathers, you say. Could you talk a bit about seeing Sharia as principles rather than this set of rules that lack context?
Sure. First of all, I mean, this whole argumentation may sound apologetic or, too defensive to some people because they can say, oh, he's trying to find good things in the beginning of Islam. Well, as a Muslim, yes, I do believe there are a lot of good things at the founding of Islam. But also, objectively speaking, there's a reason why a religion becomes popular and inspiring and makes a hit in world history, right? If a religion has terrible teachings, generally people wouldn't follow them and that religion would have died out anyway. So there is a liberating aspect of Islam, as in early Christianity, I think, or in Judaism. Judaism saved the Jewish people from, sacrificing their children to Mesopotamian deities. There are a lot of things our great religious traditions did in human history. That's why they captured hearts and minds. But once you institutionalize and stagnate a religion, it also becomes the perfect tool for using for power, blocking progress, and also by applying textualism, you can say, this is what God told me, you can do it, but you can have terrible consequences with that, which wouldn't be compatible with an ethical understanding of that religion. So that's the kind of perspective I have here. You're asking me, natural law. First of all, natural law, what does it mean? Natural law is the idea that God has given humanity an internal conscience and an order of things. So even if there's no religion, people will be able to figure out ethical rules and figure out good and bad. And even without religion, human society can move forward because there's an inherent natural quality to human beings, and there's an inherent quality to nature, so it could be figured out. So this philosophy became more powerful in Christianity because of the lack of a religious law. And also it led to the idea of natural rights, which gave us modern day liberalism, like John Locke made that argument. Now, I think bridging that perspective and the idea of a religious law is important. And this was done in Judaism by first Maimonides and then Moses Mendelssohn, which led to the Jewish Enlightenment. And I think in Islam, we need to bridge the same gap. And there are sources for doing that. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, the great medieval thinker, he speaks about what we can call natural law. And he says there are unwritten laws of humanity and there are written laws of our religious texts. And he says if there's a conflict, the unwritten laws of humanity, like justice, like compassion, like family and all that should limit, some of the written laws, because those written laws may need some changing. So it's a universalistic view. So I think this is possible in Islam, and there's a particular tradition in the study of Islamic law called maqasid, or intentions of Sharia, which can bring us to that point. This was a school of thought that emerged in the late classical Islamic civilization, and we owe it to scholars who said, okay, there are all these commandments of the Sharia, but what does God intend with these commandments? Like theft should be punished, okay? What does God intend here? Oh, he intends to protect property. So with this kind of reasoning, scholars like Imam Shatibi from Spain, they said there are 5 basic principles: protection of religion, protection of life, protection of property, protection of lineage, and protection of intellect. So these are the 5 intentions of Sharia. Now, if you look at the whole religious law with this perspective, and if we take the step towards natural law, we can say, oh, protection of intellect, it's a good idea. How do we protect it? Well, maybe classical scholars didn't discuss that much, but a government propaganda is against protection of intellect, any totalitarian propaganda, right? So actually free speech is the basis of protecting intellect, because if you have one line all the time, as you would have in North Korea or Stalin, Soviet Union, you would lose actually your intellect, and you would intellectually stagnate. So that requires a step forward in thinking in Islamic law, but I think that's possible. Some scholars are working on that. So I allude to that. One more thing, Tunisian scholar Ibn Ashur, in the 20th century, added to these 5 principles another one, and most important one, hurriya, which means liberty. So he said the intention of Sharia is liberty, and he extracted from this rules in classical Islamic law, which called for liberating slaves, freeing the slaves. And he said, so the Sharia, the lawgiver, he said, aspires for liberty. So I think with such perspectives, it is possible to reconcile Islamic thinking with liberalism in the classical sense of the word, and to reignite the call for liberty in the Muslim world, which is already powerful and popular in the 19th century, although it's been derailed to a great extent by first Western colonialism and then the reactionary ideologies of socialism and fascism and Islamism, which are still haunting Muslim societies.
Right. And you also make a very practical case for religious freedom using this metaphor of a plane crash and an island. Could you talk a bit about that?
Definitely. It's actually a shipwreck.
Sorry, it was a shipwreck.
You're welcome. But, same thing. It's, I begin that story titled, it's in the chapter, Should Muslims Conquer and Prevail? That chapter is designed to criticize the classical notion in Islamic jurisprudence that Muslims should be superior. They can conquer a land, they can take over a society, and they can tolerate non-Muslims. That's good, but not as equals, with less rights. And Islam should be supreme and dominant. Now, with this idea, Muslims conquered half of the world, from Spain to India, 1,000 years ago. And today, most Muslims don't think that they will keep conquering the world anymore. That doesn't look practical. But the idea that Islam should rule supreme in wherever Muslims are majority are still very powerful. And I criticize an American Muslim scholar of the more conservative persuasion. He says, we like liberalism in America. We like the equal rights given to us here. But back there in our home, in Pakistan or inside, we're not going to call for this. We want the supremacy of Islam. And I say, well, this is a little bit hypocritical. This is a double standard, and it's not going to work well. And then I call on Muslims to use this thought experiment to think of an ideal political entity. And the thought experiment, as you said, is I tell that, imagine there's a ship, going on the Atlantic, and the ship goes to waters, and some people survive, and they go to an island. And imagine some of them are Christians, others are Jews, Muslims, some are atheists, some are Hindu, and they're gay men, and there's another single woman, and just they're different kinds of people. I say, would you find it fair that the Muslims or the Christians take over the island in the name of Islam or in the name of Christ, saying that this is now a Christian island or an Islamic island, and everybody has to abide by the laws that we bring to you, and you have to pay taxes, so we are the supreme rulers of this island? Or, which is actually the classical model, or is it better if they just sit down and say, well, we have different ways of life, we have different philosophies, we have different inclinations, and how can we live together? We can make a minimal agreement that we will not attack each other, nobody will steal each other's property, there will be some spaces that is private for people, and then we can all share and this life on this. So it's a call for thinking in terms of a political contract instead of conquest. And I also show that, there's a story in the life of Prophet Muhammad which resembles that. The first time he went to Medina, he made a contract with the tribes there, including some Jewish tribes, which was based on equality, which later collapsed and unfortunately was forgotten in the age of Islamic empires. But I think thinking the idea of a political contract as the basis of any state is important. And if you have that vision, we can see what's wrong with Saudi Arabia today, or Iran today, or many of the Muslim states out there, which are basically supremacists in the name of Islam. And if we criticize supremacy against Muslims in the West, like white supremacy or their racist views, which rightly so, we should also not whitewash supremacy in the name of Islam.
Right. And of course, you talk about how secular governments are not necessarily liberal either. There is secular liberalism. There are governments that have tried to make it harder for Muslims to practice their faith. And so there shouldn't be a double standard there. If you believe in religious liberty in France, you should also believe in it in Saudi Arabia, right?
Exactly.
But some people, still fear that with the current state of things, maybe there isn't the amount of hope that they would like regarding the future of liberty with Islam. So even though this isn't something you talk about a lot in the book is more historically focused. What do you see as the prospects for this more liberal interpretation of Islam becoming widespread?
Mm-hmm. I would remind them that if they looked at Europe, or Christendom as it was called, in the early 17th century, they wouldn't be very optimistic about the future of Christianity as well. It was a time of the 30 Years' War where, millions in Europe perished because of the wars between Catholics and Protestants. It was a time that, writing a heretical book in England or France could put you to death by being beheaded or being burned alive at the stake. And it was a time that few Christians, believed in these ideas of toleration and religious freedom. And it was taken for granted that kings have divine rights, and that, people with the wrong faith should not be tolerated. And that is despite the fact that when you look into the founding text of Christianity, New Testament, the Gospels, you don't see dictatorial states. I mean, Jesus has a very peaceful and actually non-state, certainly non-coercive message. But Christians didn't figure that out for a long time. And I believe today parts of the Muslim world are like early 17th century Europe. Blasphemy laws, violence, like crusaders kind of people are there in the name of doing terrible things in the name of Islam. Other Muslims are totally in the 21st century. I mean, and it's a very, very diverse scene. Just I want to emphasize that. But there are pockets of orthodoxy and for worse, radicalism and militancy that are like from the early 17th, 16th century Europe. But that changed in Europe. How did it change? Well, it changed with ideas of liberty, ideas of toleration. It changed thanks to people like John Locke, which I go back and forth, in the book. I go and visit his thoughts and see how it applies to Islam today. It changed with classical liberal thinkers, with U.S. separation of church and state, which was a new thing in Christianity, in the history of Christianity. So I believe, yes, there are scenes in the Islamic world today, pockets of militancy, intolerance that is quite concerning. That's why I wrote this book. But precisely because the problem is there, this is the time to make these arguments. And precisely because the problem is there, a lot of Muslims are looking for answers and looking for a way forward. And that's why I'm disturbed with the current reality, but I'm hopeful for the future.
Right. So the key is this flourishing of reason, of a respect for freedom that you articulate so well in this book. Where in the world, going completely beyond the book, where in the world right now do you see the most reason for optimism in Muslim society? And you talked a bit about Saudi Arabia, for example, but where do you see things not moving in the right direction?
Well, there are some Muslim majority societies that are already quite free and liberal. Bosnia and Herzegovina is one of them. Albania, these are Southeastern Europe, countries. They don't have Islamic law in their constitutions. There are pious Muslims, not pious Muslims, and all kinds of minorities, and they don't have any persecution based on religion. They were persecuted in the name of communism, so that's a whole different thing. There are also other Muslim majority societies. You hear a lot of promising ideas for future. Indonesia is one of them. Indonesia, for example, has this institution called Nahdlatul Ulama, which is the world's greatest Islamic organization, actually, in terms of membership. Like more than 60 million people are members. Indonesia is, by the way, the world's most populous Muslim country, and they have taken pretty bold steps and criticizing supremacy or violence, in Islamic texts, and calling for a humanitarian Islam, as they say it. And in almost every Muslim society, I mean, in Malaysia, I was invited by the Islamic Renaissance Front, who's articulating human rights in the name of Islam and with Islamic arguments. But that's precisely why, they are under the tutelage of the authorities, and that's precisely why I was arrested when I went there to speak as a guest of Islamic Renaissance Front. So this battle is going on, and there are thinkers, there are pockets of thought. Western Muslims are discovering, I think, the blessings of liberty in America. Among American Muslims, I see a lot of people saying, well, we're glad to be living in America and not in a autocratic, theocratic state, because we can be Muslims in the way we really believe it. And I think Turkey, my country, although politically going through a terrible, terrible time, I think is maturing to some extent, seeing how bad it is to mix Islam with power. And there's a more enlightened view evolving. Even in Iran, I mean, Iran is a terrible country because of the authoritarian regime, but Iranian society includes a lot of people who are fed up with theocracy and who are looking forward. And one day there will be a regime change of some sort, and maybe we'll see a more peaceful, liberal, mature Iran. So the very fact that the scene is grim in many places, I think, is the very reason to think that there may be change. And I see the signs of that change, and I want to help those signs of change and to show them a path forward. And that's why I wrote why, as a Muslim, I defend liberty. And that's why earlier this year I published, Reopening Muslim Minds, A Return to Reason, Freedom, and Tolerance. And it's great to, discuss these with you, who's a fellow defender of liberty at the Cato Institute.
Thank you so much for having this discussion. I hope that this book becomes very widely read and does have the impact that it should.
Thank you. Translations are coming, by the way.
Oh, fantastic.
Ghazian translation, a Turkish translation, Urdu, probably we're working on those. So hopefully it will be available in other languages too. And it's widely available. I mean, people can freely download the PDF of the book at libertarianism.org, or they can order the copies. And I'll love to hear thoughts of readers, which I'm getting already, and it's going well.
I greatly enjoyed it. It's also very accessible, I would point out, even if someone doesn't have a lot of prior knowledge on this topic, while also being very dense for such a small book. You fit a lot in here.
Great, thanks. That's what it was meant to be. I'm glad that it worked that way. Thank you.
Well, congratulations on another great book, and thank you for speaking again on the Human Progress Podcast.
Thank you, Chelsea. It's a pleasure to speak to you.